Everyone, Liam here. Welcome to the new display series for YouTube. This video series is going to be going over how I'm painting Akita from Neko Galaxy. This particular video is going to be how we're painting the face. As always, I hope it's helpful. If you've got any questions, queries, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I will absolutely get back to you. Once again, your support means a huge amount to me, so thank you so much for everyone who's been watching the videos. If you do like it, hit the like button. If you want more video content, and make sure you hit the subscribe button. And without further ado, here we go. So the first thing that you can see, I've base coated the skin. I've mixed up a skin color with P3 Cygnus Yellow, P3 Khador Red. What that does is it gives me a nice pinky tone. I'm going for a very pink tone to this skin. There's gonna be lots of reds, lots of purples in this. I want to do something far more vibrant than normal with Akita. Normally my palette is very desaturated and I don't use a lot of vibrant colors. I want to break that rule in every way on this model. I want like vibrancy everywhere, saturation everywhere. So I'm a little bit nervous about it at this point, but it is what it is. So the skin tone, as always, I'm mixing up with P3 Cygnus Yellow, P3 Khador Red, and then I'm getting like a pink tone. Then I add white to it until I get some kind of skin tone. That's pretty much how I've mixed up my skin. So the face is base coated, as you can see. Now what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start sketching in my shadows and my lights. Now it's worth noting the light is going to be coming from the top left as you see her on screen. So the right hand side of the face needs to be quite dark. We need to have a really strong shadow on the right hand side of the face. And the other thing is I'm keeping my paint quite thin on this because I do want a very smooth result for her face in the end, because I want it to look really quite youthful. The idea with this is even on the sketch my paint is quite thin, so my paint is transparent enough so the color underneath shows through, but it's opaque enough to make a significant difference. So you can see at the moment how I've just slapped on this very bright red pink tone. She looks very sunburnt. That's fine. The idea is, like, you can see this is going to be all of the darker areas. Now it's really important to note when it comes to the start of this, I'm breaking down the shape overall. So the head is spherical, so the top left of her face, namely the top of the head, the left hand cheekbone as you see it on screen, and the nose, and then the top lip, those are going to be the brighter areas. That sunburnt kind of pink tone that you can see, that's going to be something around the mid-tone. So anywhere that's not a bright highlight or a dark shadow is going to have a tone around that pink sunburn type of color. Now what you're seeing on screen is I'm blending the transitions together, but it's still very sketchy, so it's not very smooth stage. And the reason for that is because we need to make sure that we get our light in place. We need to get our highlight areas in place. We need to roughly map out where we're going to go really bright, where we're going to go really dark. So all I care about is just the overall shape at the moment. Very early on with this, I'm going to start pushing those bright spots really quickly. So I'm going to add a huge amount of white to this. This is straight away, so this is like almost an off-white skin tone that I'm going to push to. That top left-hand side that we can see, the top of the head, I'm making that brighter. You can see it's quite a harsh transition. Again, this is early stages, so we don't have to worry too much. Priority is getting the values and the tones that we like. The nose itself needs to receive quite a lot of light as well. And I'm going to bring up a picture in a second, and we're going to have a good look about the areas, sort of areas that we should out when it comes to faces. Now this is why I'm not worrying too much about smoothing everything out just yet, because I know for a fact like this looks really strange at this point. I know for a fact that I'm going to keep coming back and adjusting my shadows, like how dark my shadows are and how light my lights are. See, like a big thing at the moment, the top of the head, I don't feel like that light spot on the left hand side of that head comes far enough across. So the next stage that we've got to do is start smoothing this out. I'm happy with the placement of the light, so I'm happy with the pink jawbone on this left hand side. I'm happy with the dark shadow on the right hand side. I'm happy with my highlights. So that's my sketch that I've got in place, and I'm fine with that. So now it's the point of refining it, and this is where with the sketch we were very rough and not too fussed about the shapes that we had. This is not only the part where we blend all of these areas together, this is where we make those tiny adjustments to the shape of the volumes. So whereas at the beginning I slapped down like 2 or 3 big brush strokes on the cheek and that was fine. Now what I need to do is the shape of the cheekbone needs to be mirrored by the shape of the highlight. So the highlight itself should be the same shape as the cheekbone when you're actually when you're painting the highlight in the cheekbone itself. Now what you'll notice as well is I am using the tip of my brush nearly all the time with this. So I'm using really thin paint. So this is probably 2 or 3 parts water, 1 part paint. And I am going to zoom in a second so you'll see it a lot better. And I am stippling in this case. Now I'm not worried about the dots being absolutely perfect. The idea with this is I'm going for a very smooth result, but with a very subtle amount of texture in it. So our faces are not perfectly smooth, regardless of how young people are. So there's always going to be like little pot marks. There's going to be like it's like a dotty effect on people's skin. I can't explain it, and that's what we're trying to imitate here. So I am painting with dots, but I'm not too bothered if they're not absolutely perfect. But I do want the little marks, the dots, to be as tiny as possible, because that will help with the illusion. And you can see me doing it here. Now the idea with this is I'm using the transparency of the paint, so in other words how thin the paint is, to influence the colour underneath. So if I put a colour over another colour, I want paint to be fairly transparent so it only tints that colour and doesn't leave a very hard mark. The other thing is when I'm doing this and I want a smooth result, when I'm putting paint on the model, I want the paint that's on my brush to be fairly similar to the paint that's on the model. So if I'm going over the pink, I don't just want to put the really bright white, I want to put a slightly brighter pink. So I'm using the transparency of the paint, I'm using a small gradient from the paint that's on the model to the paint that's on the brush to gradually build up a really soft transition. And I'm doing lots of like really small tiny marks here. This isn't, when you first try this isn't a very quick process. It's quite slow, but you do have a huge amount of control, and that's, for me, is something that's really important. I'm quite a controlled painter as a general rule, I think anyway, as opposed to very expressive. So what that means for me is I'm happy taking longer on a paint job, getting a much neater result. That's my priority, but you guys, it's up to you how you like to paint. You can see, especially on this cheek right now, how every little brush mark I make just tints that very white highlight tone. And I can keep jumping back and forward on this as well. Like I can keep going darker, I can keep going lighter. If you want to adjust the sorts of tones that you've got in your skin as well, there's nothing wrong with adding different colors into your skin, like into your skin mix. Add bits of blue into it, bits of purple, bits of red, yellow. Adjust your skin tones and make something a bit more interesting. Now with me, remember, I'm trying to go for something very pink. I want to keep it in theme of this model. Now the transition on this cheek is starting to come together. Now you see here I'm using more of a sweeping brush stroke. Still using the tip of my brush because that's just how I like to paint, because using the tip of my brush, the brush stroke is smaller, and again I have more control. But I'm using more of a sweeping motion there. So ultimately what I'm doing there is a more traditional glaze, but with the tip of my brush as opposed to flat of my brush. So I can continue doing those really small marks, which is what I particularly favor. You don't need to. If you wanted to do like a larger brush stroke, like more traditional glaze where you use the big side section of the brush and run it the whole way across the model, that would also work. I just tend to find that generally is a little bit messier, but that could also be the way I paint. So you need to remember that you need to adapt you need to adapt the painting style that you like to what works, not just copy what I'm doing. Now, what you can see is that cheek is starting to smooth out significantly. We have this nice bright spot on that cheek in a very small, and then a very quick transition, sorry, from that bright area of the cheek to the shadow area. This all comes down to those really small marks with that very thin paint. You can also see, like, I'm not even using a very good brush here, because all that matters is whether the brush has a tip, because it's all the tip itself is what's given me that control. So if I want to make skin brighter, I'm gonna mix up a slightly brighter mix of that skin. I'm gonna tone down the transparency, so the thickness. So the idea here is generally I've got probably 2 to 3 parts water, 1 part paint, and I'm building it up slowly, and I'm constantly just adjusting. This is the big thing here. This is when we get to this point where we're trying to get those nice smooth transitions. We need to build up very slowly. You can do the earlier stages with thicker paint, but there becomes a point if you want to smooth it out, you need to slow down, you need to do smaller marks, and this is where your brush control really comes into play here. So we've been working with the highlight areas and getting that transition right. Now what we need to start doing is need to smooth out the shadow area of the cheek, which is the pink, but it also looks very flat. And I still want to try and increase the contrast as well. Now, I can go to a red if I wanted to, but bearing in mind the theme, the colors that I'm using for this model are purple, pink, and blue. So purple is a perfect opportunity because generally it's a very dark color, or rather purple as a color is very nice when it's really dark. So this is a really good opportunity to add some purple into the skin without making it look very cartoony, because if we put blue into the skin, it's going to look very strange. But with purple, obviously, it's much closer to the nice pink tone. That works really well. You can see how it's starting to tint it now, and I'm only really doing the areas that go into the whatever the side of the face armor is. So it doesn't need to be a lot, but it needs to be enough to add interest to that shadow area, so it's not just a flat color. Now the other thing to realize as well, like this skin isn't smooth yet. We're still going to have to do a lot of fixing on the transitions, which we'll get into soon. So I'm not too bothered about it being perfect. You can already see the change in that color on the skin just adds a lot. It adds more interest. It makes it more interesting to look at. I'm not sure how realistic it is, but remember, this is, whether you believe this is an art form or not, we are doing something artistic, and we need to decide. Sometimes we just got to go with what looks good as opposed to what is accurate. And in this case, pushing that nice purple tone into the shadow area, it lifts the face up and it makes that bright area of the face much stronger, because remember, the more you surround something with dark, the brighter it looks. And this is a good representation of what we're going to be going for at the end, by the end of this face, for the bright side. But what we need to be doing is start to smooth it out now. Right, so I've zoomed right in so you can see exactly what I'm doing here. Now, the idea being, you can see these hard transition points where the purple transitions into the pink, where the pink transitions into the more white area highlights. So this is where we need to start bringing them together. Now, what we need to do, I'm going to be doing this with dots 90% of the way. And what we need to do is, when we're painting, when we want to soften the area between the light and the dark, we want to make the light area wider. We need to get that bright mix of paint, thin it down so it's like 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part paint. You can see me just placing small dots in the darker area, and what that does, that darker pink area, it will brighten it up, but because it's transparent, it gives us a color between our brightest mix and the pink, so it's almost like a bridging color. And the idea with this is we're constantly going to just be bringing these areas together with tiny little dots and marks. But what I would say is, don't be afraid to leave Like, don't worry about covering everything. It's fine to have little gaps between your little dots, because remember, although we want this smooth, we're going to be building this up smooth. We want inconsistency of all of the little marks to give us that nice texture. You can see on the heads, like the marks that I was using just then are much larger. I was being much rougher with the brush. The reason for that is because I wasn't happy with the transition. I wanted to brighten the whole of that area of the head up. So I knew, because I was going to be going back over that and softening that transition later, I don't really need to be as careful about the brush marks, because I've kind of gone back a step. Because I'm brightening up the whole of the head, it doesn't really matter about doing those really small marks, because once I've brightened the head up, then I'm going to come back with all those small marks and soften the transition again anyway. It's almost like I've gone back to the sketch stage a little bit with that. And you can see me doing this now. You can see as I place those marks down, that area of skin on the head is starting to soften. It's starting to come together. See as we get towards the right of the right hand side, so the eyebrow on the right hand side of her head, as we look at it, that's where it starts to get a little bit more messy, and that's just because I need to get a darker value of paint on my brush in that area to solve that transition, to blend that transition together. Shameless plug time. If you guys are looking for additional in-depth detailed display painting videos, then feel free to check out my Patreon, which is in the links below. If you are looking to improve your painting much faster and you want some support, I am available for one-to-one tuition. I do teach full-time, both online and in person, or I am available for commissions if you guys want something painted up to a display standard. Once again, thank you everyone for support. Feel free to check out all the links in the descriptions below. Hope the video is helpful. Next part we need to do is start pushing some of the shadows in the more detailed areas. So under the eye, as an example, that area would be in shadow. So you've got a choice here. You can either paint it as a normal skin tone, or you can do it like a bit more fantasy or makeup. In my case, I chose to add purple underneath it, like it was makeup. And it also fits the whole idea of the colours that we've got in her skin tones. So under the eye, and also under the eyebrow as well, is going to be an area that we need to push. You see that I'm back to smoothing out these transition areas. So above the lip, it's really important that that area is bright, and you can see again that I'm softening this out with lots of little dots and marks. So the way that you can think of this is ultimately what we're doing is a stippling, but it's a bit of a hybrid between stippling and glazing. So with glazing, we're using an ultra thin paint to smooth out our brush marks and to potentially filter, changing different colors into our model. The difference with this is we're doing exactly the same thing, but using very small brush marks, and we're encouraging a texture to appear depending on our brush marks. Whereas in traditional glazing, we're looking for a very smooth result with no material texture. Whereas in this, we're kind of encouraging that texture in a way that we choose. Now you can see that the nose is very bright. Also, you can see this line around the nostril. There's a line of light that goes around the nostril. These sorts of things are really important. Just because we have a recess doesn't mean it's not going to receive light. This is one of the reasons why we use a roadmap. This is one of the reasons why we use reference material. In this case, I'm using reference material. I'm using photography reference material. So portraits of photographs of women under extreme light. And that helps tell me where these little areas are going to be. So for example, another really good one is on the inside of the eye and the inner curve next to the nose. Most people paint that as a shadow, and actually we should have that as quite a bright area, because the light's coming in from the top left, it's going to hit directly in that area. So these are really important small details that we really need to make sure that we're painting in, because they add an element of realism to it. If we miss these sorts of details, then it ends up looking quite cartoony. Around her eyes at this point, I feel like they're looking very plain, especially for the character that we've built up for her. So what I decided to do was mix up some of the pinky purple tone, and I'm now glazing in. So this is a more traditional glaze, so I'm still using that very thin paint, but I'm using the side of my brush and I'm gradually building up this pink tone around the top of her eye, just underneath the eyebrow there. This is just to add some visual interest, because ultimately she needs, underneath the eyebrow there, she needs to have a shadow, because it shouldn't be as bright as what is on the top of the head. But by adding some color into it as well, it gives the impression that she's wearing makeup. And although you don't have to have makeup on female models when you're doing something like a cyberpunk lady, it's very fitting and fits the character. So all I've done with that is I've glazed over 3 or 4 coats of very thin purple paint, and I've just built it up around that area, and it looks quite nice. It adds a lot of visual interest to her face. It breaks up the monotony of all of that bright skin tone. Now I'm going to come back to smoothing everything out. What you're going to start to see me doing now is my dot marks. So these little dots that I've been doing previously, these are going to start to change into more of like a little mini sweeping motion. So instead of just doing dots, what's going to start happening is my brush strokes are going to start going into a very small sideward brush stroke motion. The idea with this is what's happening is all of these little dots and marks that I have on this model starting to make them more subtle. So with a very thin paint, the idea being this paint is quite transparent, so as soon as I paint over something, still see everything that's underneath it. What's going to happen is all of those little brush marks that we've made are going to start softening out, going to start becoming far more subtle. This is the point as well. So I'm fairly far into this now. I'm really liking this skin that I have on this model, but I have realized as well that I need to go brighter. I can push the contrast in value. I can push my brights much more on this model. But at the same time, I don't want to ruin all the work that I've done, because I've spent a long time working on this skin now. I think this is probably 3 hours in at this point. So instead, what I'm doing, instead of like redoing the sketch with those big brush marks, I'm adding a lot more white to my skin tone. So this is pretty much an off-white. So I'm very, very bright here. Thinned it down quite a lot, so I'm still working with that ultra thin paint. I'm building up these dots again, and what I'm doing is, because that off-white is so thin, it's going to go on there transparent. It's going to build up our highlight areas much slower. It's going to give us that nice soft transition, so we haven't got to do all that work again. By taking a little bit of extra time now, building up these layers very, very slowly, it's going to save us a lot of time in the long run. Now, if you want to, again, you can always glaze this in the more traditional fashion. Again, I don't particularly like working like that, because it still leaves a big blob of paint wherever you take the brush off. So this works better for me. Adapt it to your style of your process. You can see the really important part here is that this model has enough contrast in value in light and dark, even if it is on the bright side. So we could go a lot darker, but remember, if we go too dark, we're not going to be able to go any darker on the dark side of the face. So we need enough contrast in value, but not an extreme amount, because we need to be able to push darker on the right hand side of the face that's in shadow. So in this case, because I don't want to go to black, because I don't want to go extreme dark, benefits me to go brighter, because if we go brighter, it makes our darker areas look darker, which is why I'm pushing so extreme with this highlight on the top of the head and the cheek, why I'm going to almost white. You can see that now, especially on the peak of the head there and the peak of the cheekbone, almost going to a white here. The reason for that is because it's going to make the darker areas on the face look darker. It's going to create an extreme amount of contrast in value. Already going to have a contrast, we're already going to have lots of contrast in saturation anyway, because although we have lots of color in the face, which we do, there's lots of pinks, there's lots of purples, blue of the eyes, because we've got so much white in the skin tone in the highlight area as well, that in itself is creating a type of contrast. So we have, if you look at it, the idea is, as always, we want contrast in light and dark because that's the most powerful type that we can use. But we also have like this contrast in saturation that sucks you in. So the hair is very saturated. We've got a huge amount of color in that. Then we have the skin, which is quite desaturated. Like the highlight area is incredibly desaturated. There's loads of white in it, that bright area. And then we have the eyes, which are really, really potent. We've got really strong blue in those eyes. So it draws you in as well. So those are two types of contrast that we're currently using. The other type of contrast that we're going to be using later on is also a textural contrast, but we'll get into that when we talk about the denim jacket. Now we need to work on the abomination that is the shadow side of the face. You can see how messy it is. You can see that I've got that big chunk of that dark purple. The other thing with that dark purple is as well is if you look, there's quite a lot of grey in it. It's quite desaturated. I've added black to that purple when I put it on because I wanted to have less vibrancy in the shadow. This is something that you can think about, is if you've got like quite a vibrant color scheme, if you don't want an area to draw the eye, kind of remove a little bit of the color. What that'll do is it will make it less of a feature and less important. But you can see I'm starting to smooth this out. So I've got that big old pink mid-tone. Now it looks very strange, as you saw from when we did the bright side of the face. That's fine. We can solve that as we did previously. You can see here when I'm doing my brush marks are much stronger now. That's because my paint is thicker. So this is probably 1, maybe 2 parts water to 1 part paint. I'm also using I'm using the P3 as well, because this is the original skin tone mix. So by using thicker paint, it means that I can build the transitions a little bit faster. So the more I go towards needing to smooth something out, the thinner my paint goes. But the rougher the stage is, the thicker my paint is, because that just means that I can work much faster. Now, what I wanted to go over is the light is coming from top left, as you see face on screen at the moment. Now, we have this, and I can show you in some examples actually. So when we have light coming from one side, so in this case, in this photo, this is one of the reference photos that I was using for female faces. So in this case, the light is coming from that side there, so top left. See, just like ours, we have the bright spot here, the bright on the cheekbone, the bright on the face. Now this photo the contrast is a bit extreme, but that's fine because it works for what we're trying to achieve. So it's a very similar lighting to us, and what we tend to find is when we have the light that comes across from one side towards the front, we always end up with this little triangle of light on the shadow side of the face, which is a really nice way to break things up. And although we don't have it on this particular model because the jawbone is covered by the armor panels, also see we have this bounce light. Anyone who's been looking at the non-metal series, we've got this bounce light on the bottom of the jawbone. So those are both incredibly important. You don't need to worry about the bounce light on the jawbone at the moment because we don't have that on our model. But when it comes to the darker side of the face, we really need to make sure get this in. And if you look at portraits and even artwork of people, not just women, people in general, when we have the light coming from one side, we will nearly always have this little triangle. And it's really, really important to define the features on the shadow side of the face. And you can start, and you can see me placing that in now. That's exactly what I'm working on, this bright area, doing it on the inside of the eye and just above the cheekbone before it curves around to the side of the face. Now, how bright you go with it depends entirely on what you're trying to achieve. If you've got quite a strong light source, which is what I'm going with, this right hand side of the face is nearly going to be as bright as the left hand side, but I would always personally make it a little bit darker just because I tend to find that it looks more interesting. It gives us another range, gives us another value to play with. So it keeps the left hand side of the face really bright. Keeps that bright spot on the left hand side of the face most important part, draws your eye to it, but it adds shape and it adds interest to the shadow side of the face, which is far less interesting. And you can see me building up these marks now. Now I'm going to speed this up a little bit more than previously because ultimately this is exactly what I was doing earlier, where I'm transitioning these colors together and blending them. Now what you'll see is at the moment I'm trying to make that bright area larger, so I was working quite a lot with brighter colors and pushing it into the darker areas. Then what that does is it softens as I'm going with this really thin paint, it softens down the marks that I'm leaving. It's also worth noting, like the shadow color at the moment, I really like bright side of the face, and I like the bright area under the eye on the shadow side of the face, but I'm really disliking the color that I have for the shadows. I don't like the pink is too sunburnt, so we need to change that, like we said. Not too sure about the purple at this point, it looks a bit too strong and a bit too cartoony. And what you see on screen at the moment is where I start to experiment with the colors on the actual shadow side of the face. So most of that I end up making disappear, but I'm going to show you it anyway because I think it's important to see the footage. But you can see how I'm widening this. I'm widening in all of my bright areas. So although with like the shadow side of the face, we still need to get some semblance of skin tone. So when I'm trying to brighten up the areas, what I'm actually doing with that really thin skin tone, I'm going over those dark areas with a skin tone because it ties it in. If I use the skin tone if that skin tone is very thin and I put it over purple or I put it over pink, though it's not going to be that bright, it's going to bring balance to the paintwork because that skin tone is what's running throughout, obviously, her skin. And what happens is when we put that skin tone over the purple, all it does is bring a brighter purple, or if we put it over pink, it brings a brighter pink. So we're not putting the skin tone on the model in the sense of we place skin tone on the model and then it leaves a big chunk of bright skin tone. What we're doing is it's almost like we're adding a filter. We're adjusting the colors that we've got on her face, the pinks and the purples. We're using the skin tone mix that we've been using on the rest of the face. We're using that to tint and adjust the shadow colors. The last stage is now is we just need to, like, the face looks fine. When we look at the face from the front or from the left hand side, the bright side, looks fine. It's nice and smooth. It's very believable. The shadow side of the face is really quite funky at this point. Reason for that is because it's not smoothed out in comparison to everything else. There's nothing wrong with those purple tones that we have in it now. The only adjustment that I'm going to make to the values next is when the dark side that you can see on screen there, as that pushes towards that armor plate, at the end stage, I'm going to glaze over, more traditional glaze with like that large sweeping brush stroke, and glaze in a black, or rather a black with a very small amount of purple to push the shadow and to remove any of the less appealing brush marks from how we've stippled this. And it pushes that shadow to the extreme, which is exactly what we want, because with the position of her head, we don't want to have a huge amount of light in that area. Now, as I said, it would be really beneficial if she actually didn't have that armor panel. It would be a really strong feature to put that jawbone, that bounce light on the jawbone. But obviously with this, we don't have that luxury. Now, I've zoomed out. Specifically, I know you guys want to see the close-ups and that's cool, but I've zoomed out specifically because it's really important that we take a step back and look at our models from afar. Because remember, these models are not meant to be viewed like on a massive screen, hyper zoomed in like you guys are seeing it. You need to, when we get to a point where we're nearly finished, we need to take a step back and really get a good look and decide from further away, because all of these tiny little brush marks that I've been showing you on screen, you can't see most of them in person. And if we're looking at things up close too much, then we kind of lose perspective on what we're trying, on what it really looks like, on what we're really getting out of it. Now, I'm just going to paint in the eyebrows here, and I'm going to put some color on the lips, just so this is one of those things where it's really good sometimes just to put a base coat onto some of the features to see how it looks in context with everything else. So all I'm going to do for now is just black out the eyebrows, black out the lips, not painting any other highlights on for the time being because it's not really that relevant right now. We'll come back to those later because we need to make some color choices for them. But it does give us a very good idea of what the skin is going to look like. So that's the process for the face on Akita. Potentially, as always, may come back and make small adjustments later on. The skin colors, as always, are mixed from 3 primaries. So P3 Cygnus Yellow, P3 Khador Red, and P3 Cygnar Blue. Now, whether you use those or whether you use pre-mixed skin tone is entirely up to you. The only thing that I would say to you in this regards is if you're struggling to mix purples because they can be an absolute nightmare. What I would recommend is just to get a decent set of purples. It's really hard to mix a nice purple. My preferred purple is Vallejo model color Violet. It's quite a desaturated purple. And then if I want something a bit more saturated, I'll use Scale 75 Ink Intensity Purple, which is an ink, and I'll add it to the paints. But it's entirely up to you. What I would probably suggest is, I'm a big believer in you should be mixing your own skin tones because it will always give you a far more organic look, far more natural look, and you'll also learn a lot more from it as well. But again, it's entirely up to you. I hope this video has been helpful. We've got a lot more to come on Akita, so keep an eye out, and thanks as always for watching. Catch you all later.